Kai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei, 7.3%. Take a second to ponder that record-busting inflation figure, the highest in 32 years. And you're paying for it every day. It's the roof over your head, food in your belly, petrol at the pump, even the shoes on your feet. We'll break it down for you. Kiwi golf caddy Sam Pinfold's $400,000 payday after his boss, Aussie Cameron Smith, wins the British Open. The race for rats and masks, now they're free. Meanwhile, Australia ponders what to do with more than 150 million unwanted COVID vaccines. And the nutty story about a man who broke a world record pushing a peanut up a mountain. Catch us on Sky Channel 83.
RNZ News at 5. Ahi Marie. Good afternoon. Ko Iwi Ashton tēnei. Rising prices for construction are at the forefront of the steepest hike in inflation for more than 3 decades. Over the last year, the Consumer Price Index increased 7.3%, and Stats NZ says a big factor is that the cost of building houses increased by 18%. Craig Cordwell from Cordwell Construction in Auckland says the higher cost of living and labour is forcing prices upwards.
We run 4 vehicles in the company, and so the guys have to get reimbursed, so that as such, fuel costs just go up quickly as well. Because even staff, it's harder for them to live on their wage, and then you just got to effectively pay everyone more. Groceries are also going up, living costs, rents, power, cell phone.
Craig Cordwell says his company doesn't give set prices for building work at the start of a job anymore, as prices are so unpredictable. Health staff at Wairarapa Hospital say pressure on the system can't be called a crisis anymore, it's a catastrophe. The emergency department and general ward had just 2 staff on deck at times over the weekend. Head of ED, Dr Norman Gray, says staffing numbers are averaging half full currently. He says they're not being believed by the government when they call for help.
I heard the Minister say, it's not a crisis. Well, I think he's right. It's more than a crisis. It's really becoming a catastrophe now. And, last night with 1 nurse in ED, almost unheard of. That's less than we had when we had industrial action, during the RDA strike and nursing strikes.
Dr Gray says it's simple. The hospital needs more staff. More than 3,000 properties are without power in Canterbury, which is being buffeted by strong winds. The wind has brought down trees onto power lines in many areas. About 2,000 Orion customers are without power. Outages are affecting a further 900 EA networks and Alpine Energy customers in South Canterbury and 380 with Main Power North Canterbury. Orion's spokesperson, Steve McDonald, says many of the company's outages are in the Kimberley, Darfield and Sheffield areas, but crews can only do repairs if it's safe.
So at the moment the wind speeds are up around the 85 to 90 kilometres an hour, and that's probably not safe for them. So as those wind speeds drop, we will attend.
Strong wind warnings are in place for much of the South Island, in addition to heavy rain warnings. Waka Kotahi is urging motorists to take extra care travelling through Canterbury and Otago. The Transport Agency says conditions are likely to be particularly treacherous in some parts overnight. As well as bringing down trees and power lines on roads, the winds have whipped up dust, affecting visibility on some highways in inland Canterbury. Waka Kotahi South Island Journey Manager, Treska Forrester, says anyone travelling in a high-sided vehicle, on a motorcycle or towing vehicles should delay travel if possible. An Auckland testing station is seeing a huge spike in demand for free rat tests and masks. This comes after the government made rat tests available for everyone, regardless of symptoms, last Thursday. The site lead at South Seas Testing Centre in Otada, Feline Pauli Taitafi, says more and more cars are coming through.
Daily we'd give out about 2,000 a day, and that's risen to about 8,000, close to 10 in the last 4 or 5 days.
P2 and N95 masks are also available for vulnerable and high-risk individuals. And a car being driven on the wrong side of Auckland's southern motorway hit another vehicle during a police chase this afternoon. One person has been arrested. Haisa Almeida has the story.
The police were notified around 12:30 of a suspect vehicle on State Highway 1. The motorist fled the scene and was pursued by an Eagle helicopter before driving into police spikes at the Ellerslie-Panmure Highway ramp. During the chase, the suspect drove on the wrong side of the motorway, hitting a car. The police say the member of the public in the other vehicle had minor injuries and the suspect was taken into custody.
To sport, and a disappointed Tom Walsh has missed out on a third World Championship medal. Walsh finished in fourth with a throw of 22.08 metres in the shot put final at World Athletics Championships in Oregon, behind a trio of Americans. Two-time Olympic champion and world record holder Ryan Krauser won the gold medal with a championship record distance of 22.94 metres. Walsh won the gold in the event in 2017 and the bronze in 2019. Auckland's Jack O'Gill was seventh in the shot put today. New Zealand's Scott Dixon has joined Mario Andretti for the second most wins in IndyCar history. Dixon has won the latest round in Toronto, the 52nd of his career. It ends a winless drought of 23 races for the six-time champion.
It's amazing, honestly, to be close to Mario. Every time I'm asked these questions, I'm just so thankful that we still have AJ and him in the pits. We get to see them, we get to talk to them. It's just fantastic. So it's huge, man. Just feel so lucky to be a part of this group.
Dixon is now up to fourth in the championship standings, with Marcus Ericsson still on top. Fellow New Zealander Scott McLaughlin finished ninth in Toronto. And Rugby Australia has banned for life a fan who climbed onto the roof of a stand at Sydney Cricket Ground and urinated during the test between the Wallabies and England on Saturday. A 31-year-old man was arrested after the incident, which was filmed by other fans in the sellout crowd and posted to social media. That's the news.
Patrick has said, if it was the denigration... he's thought about this a lot, and he says, if it was the denigration of men in New Zealand that destroyed the All Blacks and made it impossible for them to perform, why did this not affect the Irish? Woman up, dude.
I don't think you can question the physicality and the commitment to the effort of the players on the field, can you? That wasn't the problem. They were just outplayed.
Pile on, Oren, with Morning Report, weekdays from 6 on RNZ National.
You're on Checkpoint with Lisa Owen next. Right now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Tuesday. From Northland to Taranaki, also for Coromandel, Bay of Plenty, Taupo and Taumarunui. Showers turning to rain from tomorrow afternoon with thunderstorms possible. From Gisborne to Wairarapa, also for Taihape, Whanganui and Manawatu. High clouds increasing today. Scattered rain is developing later tomorrow. Severe northwest gales in exposed parts of southern Wairarapa easing tomorrow. From Horowhenua to Wellington, also for Marlborough and Nelson, scattered showers turning to rain for a time tomorrow. Strong or gale northwesterlies, severe in exposed parts of Wellington and Marlborough easing tomorrow. From Bulla to Fiordland, rain with heavy falls and thunderstorms turning to showers in Fiordland tonight and elsewhere tomorrow morning or afternoon. Canterbury, Otago and Southland. Periods of rain, mainly inland today with heavy falls near the main divide. Gale norwesterlies, severe in exposed places, easing from tonight. And for the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods. It's 7 minutes past 5. I'll update you with the latest headlines and any traffic news at about 20 past 5.
Nā mihi iwi, tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai ki Checkpoint I tēnei rā, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Another record-busting rate no one wants to boast about. Inflation has reached a 32-year high of 7.3%, meaning the cost of pretty much everything is on the rise. Some economists think that its inflation has peaked and will now start to decrease. But from its lofty heights, it's inflicting plenty of pain. Sally Wenley reports.
It's official, and it's confirming what most people's wallets are already telling them. The price of just about everything has shot up over the last year, from fuel, rent and building materials to eggs, milk and meat.
Everything's getting dearer and dearer, that's all I know, and the money's worth less and less and less.
Just sort it out. Please lower inflation because we're all poor.
And I, being slightly older than you, have paid off my mortgage, so I can afford $2 more for the butter. And I got told at this Pack and Save yesterday, why are you buying those macarons? They cost $11. They're expensive.
Well, to get a healthy diet, I think we have to spend at least over $100 on groceries a week, which is what we don't have.
It's not just expensive groceries that are raising eyebrows. Stats New Zealand says the inflation figure is being driven primarily by fuel and construction costs, something that came as a surprise to Kiwi Bank's chief economist Jared Kerr.
The big surprise from our point of view was the cost of building a home, up 18% on the last year. We've seen some big price gains just about everywhere in the housing market, including rents. But the cost of building a home was a big surprise to us.
Jared Kerr says the Reserve Bank's response, raising interest rates, is the right thing to do to try to lower inflation. However, that won't happen overnight, and the building sector is frustrated about the current situation. Caldwell Construction works across the Auckland region, and the owner Craig Caldwell says it's had no choice but to keep charging more for its work.
The whole structure of our business has changed in regards to supplies of materials, generally dealing with clients as well and quoting, because quotes are changing monthly now with inflation.
Craig Caldwell says prices of just about everything in the building trade are unpredictable. Hence, he's unable to give clients a set quote before his teams go on site.
We run 4 vehicles in the company, and so the guys have to get reimbursed, so that as such fuel costs just go up quickly as well. Even staff, it's harder for them to live on their wage, and then you just got to effectively pay everyone more. Groceries are also gone up, living costs, rents, power, cell phone, daycares, everything.
The high cost of wages and ingredients is affecting people in the hospitality sector, forcing restaurants, bars and cafes to tweak their prices. One of those is Duopoly Road, a bar and eatery in Auckland's Herne Bay, and its owner Benjamin McManus says the price of a staple basic that every kitchen uses has boiled over.
We've seen more than 12% increase alone on cooking oil that we use every day, and that's one of the biggest costs we have in the restaurant.
Increasing expenses is leaving some people's cupboards bare, with more beneficiaries needing to reach out to food banks to feed their whānau. Tony and her 2 school children live in South Auckland, and she sometimes can't afford to pay for all her groceries at the supermarket.
Yes, like recently, where I've had to put a whole lot of stuff back. But yeah, I didn't expect anyone to do anything. It was just like, I've got to get my basics. I've got to get what can go far.
Tony says her number one focus is on being able to afford to feed her children. The government says there are no simple fixes in the face of global inflation, and that it recognises this is a tough time.
Well, joining us now is Ian Hutson, who is the Director of the Salvation Army's Social Policy and Parliamentary Unit. Kia ora, Ian.
Kia ora, Lisa.
So, inflation running red hot, basically touching, everything that people need to live just to get by in life. So what kind of demand are you seeing for help?
Well, we're seeing it across a range of things. Probably, not surprising when you look at the inflation figures, is that in our housing services, we're seeing it really hard for people who are in our transitional housing to get out of transitional housing into long-term rental. They just can't afford the rental costs, and a lot of the people that come to us for other reasons, such as food, or we've got financial mentoring programs as well, and sometimes people come there also because rent has become such a big part of what people's budgets are, and that's shown up in the figures that came out today.
And what about food? You talked about food there. Are you seeing more demand for help in that department?
Demand for food is high. It's been steady. It's really, in some ways, what we feel like's happened with this inflation. The figures that we see today isn't any surprise at all to us, because really it's been accentuating what's been happening all along. And so our food, the people coming for food is up, but it's steady. It's above what it was before COVID. But that to us is, we can handle that at the moment with the support we're getting. What is really concerning us more is around the housing side of things, because what we're seeing is that people are struggling to get into a rental accommodation that they can afford.
And are you seeing a different range of people needing help with that?
Yes, there are people, it's hard always to be sure who they are, but some of the people perhaps lost work, or one party didn't have access to benefits maybe, and now they've got housing costs that are above what they were previously. Yeah, that's the kind of people we're seeing, but the people that come into our transitional housing, often we're able to get them sorted and everything, but then it's quite hard to get them into the next level when you look at how many people are waiting on the housing register, and the gap between what people can afford in, say, social housing and the private market is huge. And we just think there's a real need to, I mean, we're really grateful for the government coming out in some senses with this transport, subsidy, and with the petrol costs, tax reduction. But we really feel that there's the people that we care for really need a bit more focus than some of the more general initiatives that the government's come up with.
Okay, so the government...
More focused.
You have acknowledged the fuel discount there and the public transport half price. There is also the winter energy payment the government would point to, and this cost of living payment that is going to kick in shortly. On top of that, what do you think is needed?
One of the things that we've been advocating really strongly for is the accommodation supplement to be updated. It is now based on rents that are about 6 years out of date. And in some places, the rents have gone up double, like Porirua being a really good example of a place where the rent is now more or less twice what it was when the rents were, the level of accommodation supplement was set. So what's happening in places like Porirua, it's not the only place, but people are now having their income completely swallowed up by the housing costs. And of course, the good thing about the accommodation supplement is that it's means tested. So it means really the people that need it get it, not just everybody in a general kind of way.
So given the figures that you've just discussed there, Ian, is it realistic in your mind that it would really need to double the housing supplement in order to meet some of the costs that people are now seeing and putting a roof over their head?
That's why the whole thing needs to be looked at, because some regions have gone up significantly. And I think that one part of that is they need to look at the regions. Like Porirua, I picked on as an extreme, and in Porirua's case, you'd almost, for people to get back to where they were 6 years ago, you would need to double it. That might not be seen as feasible, but it does need to be increased and done in a regional way, because people are being impacted significantly differently in the different areas. Take Queenstown as an example. I know that the council there has been really trying hard to get, there's like a boundary that was set about 13 years ago. One side of it, people are getting extremely different and less rent sort of accommodation supplement support, and yet their rents now are more or less the same as across an artificial line. And that's just to give an idea of the kind of thing that people are having to face in the middle of all these price increases, of which housing is probably the most significant of all of these things.
Ian, good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us. That's Ian Hutson, who's the Director of the Salvation Army's Social Policy and Parliamentary Unit. It is 18 minutes past 5. Kia mau tonu mai. Stay with us. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. Health staff at Wairarapa Hospital say pressure on the system can't be called a crisis anymore. It's a catastrophe. The emergency department and the general ward has been down to just 2 staff on shift several times in the last week. Our reporter Kirsty Frame has been in the region today.
Trudy Pearce has been a nurse in Wairarapa Hospital's general ward for 4 years. On Friday evening, it was just her and a junior nurse responsible for 23 patients. She says it was incredibly stressful.
I just was, basically hoping to God that there was no MAC calls that we had to deal with or any emergencies, because we would have been screwed, basically.
It's not the only time this has happened. On Sunday, the emergency department was also staffed by just 2 people. Dr. Norman Gray is head of the emergency department and says the situation is dire.
I heard the Minister say, it's not a crisis. Well, I think he's right. It's more than a crisis. It's really becoming a catastrophe now. And, last night with one nurse in ED, almost unheard of. That's less than we had when we had industrial action, during the RDA strike and nursing strikes.
The department has hit an all-time nursing staff low, with some working more than 10 days in a row. There's been a combination of staff leaving the hospital for overseas or entirely, and remaining staff getting sick. Dr. Gray says they're not being believed by the government when they call for help.
Even if you were heard, you never felt you were believed, and I think that's still the case now. When the Minister feels that people are not quite telling the truth, even when they're using the ministry statistics.
Dr. Gray is aware of other hospitals around the country and within the Wellington region that have been incentivising their nurses for the extra work, things like overtime or even triple overtime. But there's been no sign of that available at Wairarapa Hospital. Dr. Gray says Health NZ isn't being equitable.
There's a lack of tangible thank you from the system to our doctors and nurses and other staff here in the Wairarapa. I'm not quite sure why that is. And when people hear people elsewhere doing the same job are getting some sort of tangible reward or appreciation, it builds resentment.
He says it's simple. The hospital needs more staff, but things like extra money will help alleviate some stress on the remaining nurses and make them feel valued for their tireless work. Nurse Trudy Pearce is worried that burnout among herself and her colleagues is looming. She says there's been times she feels disillusioned about her career choices, something she retrained passionately to do.
If any teenager or school leaver came and said, I want to be a nurse, I would just totally put them off becoming a nurse. There's just nothing nice about being a nurse at the moment, and as far as we can see, it's only going to get worse.
Masterton Mayor Lynn Patterson says the state of the hospital is concerning and the community needs to step up and help alleviate pressure. She says, like many places, there's been a decline in mask use in indoor spaces. She's calling on businesses to toughen their stance.
I really ask that our businesses in the Wairarapa work together and collectively start pushing back at people who are not wearing masks.
Health NZ says it recognises the stress that staff are under. Interim District Manager Dale Olive says they are working hard to find solutions and are already reducing or deferring some planned care to alleviate stress.
It is 21 minutes after 5. You're with Checkpoints on RNZ National. That headline inflation rate skyrocketing 7.3%. Let us know how you are stretching every dollar. Interested in ways to save in accommodation and food costs, everything basically. It's touching every part of our lives. Homai o whakaaro. Do send us your feedback. Text us on 2101 and tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. And coming up, the cost of construction is through the roof. We'll talk about why that is. Right now, though, it is time for the headlines. Ko iwi anō tēnei.
Kia ora, Lisa. Rising prices for construction are at the forefront of the steepest hike in inflation for more than 3 decades. Over the last year, the Consumer Price Index increased 7.3%, and Stats NZ says a big factor is that the cost of building houses increased by 18%. Finance Minister Grant Robertson says the figures reflect the volatile and uncertain global environment. A nurse at Wairarapa Hospital says it feels like no one's listening to calls for help amid catastrophic conditions. Trudy Pearce says on Friday evening it was just her and a junior nurse caring for 23 patients in the hospital's general ward, a situation which puts patients at risk and nurses under huge pressure. The Transport Agency is warning South Island motorists to take extra care on the roads tonight as strong winds continue to batter the area and crews are attending downed power lines and trees across Canterbury, where more than 3,000 properties are without power. The Ministry of Health is reporting 7,612 community cases of COVID-19 today, and 797 people are in hospital. 22 people have died with the virus, including 7 deaths from previous months. And Britain's first extreme heat warning has come into effect, with parts of southern England expected to reach 40 degrees Celsius tomorrow. The government says it's treating the red alert as a national emergency. Those are the headlines. Looking at traffic in the main centres. In Wellington, a strong wind warning is currently in place on Remutaka Hill. Please take care if you're in light or high-sided vehicles. Those strong wind warnings, of course, are also in place for the top of the South Island on the Marlborough side, also for Canterbury, the West Coast and coastal Otago. I'll update you with the latest headlines and traffic at about 5:40.
Ngā mihi, Evie. Testing stations are seeing more and more demand for rats and masks now that they're free for everyone, regardless of whether they have symptoms. There's also been increased demand for PCR tests as those in doubt about their result want to get more certainty. Our reporter Louise Tanuth and camera operator Nick Monroe went to visit some of Auckland's testing stations.
A Monday morning at the Balmoral testing station hasn't looked this busy in a while. There's a queue of walk-ins and a steady stream of cars eager to get their hands on more rats and free masks. Paul Coates is among those lining up.
Somebody in our household has a sore throat. So basically the sensible thing to do is to stock up on test kits because you never know.
Stocking up now a lot easier with a quick phone call and then a pick-up at the testing station.
Give us your number, which you receive texted to you, you pick it up, you're on your way.
And for those that need to test often, making rats free is a huge help.
I'm a high school teacher and we've got a kid in daycare, so
We've just been away on holiday and been to a gig and we haven't had COVID yet, so we're just kind of waiting for it to happen maybe. We probably would never really buy one. No, definitely not. It's not really feasible.
Across town at South Seas Testing Centre in Otara, it's a similar story.
Daily we give out about 2,000 a day, and that's risen to about 8,000, close to 10 in the last 4 or 5 days.
That's site lead Verlaine Poley Taitawhe. She says there's still a lot of certainty around rats, with many people coming through for PCRs instead.
I'm just wanting reassurance. A lot of travellers as well, if they test positive on their rats, then it's a requirement for them to get a PCR test on the day 3 and 5 of them being in New Zealand.
She says rats can be tricky for elderly especially.
The ones who are not really confident doing the rats themselves or don't have access to be able to upload their results. So we just do the test for them or help them place orders on their phones when they come through.
P2 and N95 masks are also available for vulnerable and high-risk individuals, but Verlaine says that's causing confusion.
Not everyone fits the criteria of wearing an N95 mask. For example, if you're asthmatic, you'll actually find it quite hard to breathe in the N95 mask, so these are more safer on like the general scale rather than us giving you a mask that might not best protect you. It could actually do you more harm.
Oh, aren't you wonderful? Aren't you wonderful?
Peter and Jan Graham made the trip through today, thankful to be able to stock up.
We live in a retirement village and need to keep ourselves safe and the rest of our residents safe, and so we've come down today to get those tests.
They're even picking up a few extra boxes for those in their retirement village unable to get here. Masks are an added bonus.
They told me I can get some masks here as well, is that right?
Yeah. With numbers growing each day.
Look, I'm at the 69 at the moment, and I should get around about 100 by 4 p.m. Yesterday, I hit the 170 mark by 4 p.m.
It's a positive reminder to wear a mask and get tested.
And if you were listening to that on radio, we'll put the video from Louise and Nick on our webpage. It pays to keep the boss relaxed and on their game. Just ask Kiwi golf caddy Sam Pinfold, who's hit the jackpot at the British Open in Scotland. Wellington-born Pinfold caddied for Australian Cameron Smith in what was a come-from-behind victory over local favourite Rory McIlroy at St Andrews. The Queenslander, who sports a mullet, broke Tiger Woods' scoring record in the historic victory. One of Sam Pinfold's buddies, David Pollock from the Parapara Umu Beach Golf Club, told me it's Sam's easygoing approach that makes all the difference, and he had such a good feeling that the pair might win, he set his alarm especially for the occasion.
And I actually woke up just before 3, before my alarm, and Cam was on about the 6th hole, I think, from memory. So pretty much saw the whole thing unfold.
And we're glued to it, no doubt.
I didn't go anywhere.
So it's a win for Cameron Smith, but how much of a win is it for Sam?
Oh, I mean, yeah, Sam's he's a real cool bloke. You know, I think I think that's probably part of the reason Cam keeps him on, is the fact, you know, that's probably what is their biggest attribute, I think, is they're just good mates. And I think along with that, Sam's just a good bugger, which I think you've got to be in that situation. It's very high stress, and if you've played golf before, you can be tested, your emotions and everything that goes along with it, and I just can't imagine what it's like at that level. It must be unreal.
So what's Sam like with stress? You know, I mean, like, well, should we go to the 13th hole? What do you reckon Sam's like with stress?
From what I get, I mean, you know, I know Sam pretty well. Sam and I, we talk during the summer and his time off. I host him in the summer months when he's back. So we talk quite a bit. And from what I can get, Cam pretty much makes most of the calls. So I would imagine that scenario on the 13th on Saturday would have been all Cam. Cam would have made the decision to try and hit that shot with a real awkward stance out of the bunker, and then it just went from one thing to another, and I think it was up to Cam to get himself out of it. Sam would have been just holding his emotions, and, you know, Sam's talked about in the past a number of situations, and at the Players was a classic example. You know, we're going down the 18th, Cam's hit it in the trees and then chipped it out of the trees into the water, and same thing. You know, that's the pressure of golf. You just do things that you wouldn't normally do.
Because, you know, David, when the doo-doo hits the spinny thing, people like to point the finger at the caddy.
I've been there. I spent 4 days caddying for Christian Cullen down at the New Zealand Open one day, and I called the wrong club once, and I never called another club again because it was all my fault. So, yeah, I mean, I think you're best to keep out of it as a caddy and let the player. I think Cam himself, he's pretty sure of himself and really he understands his game. And I'm not sure anyone at that level could really instruct too much. And Sam's not that guy, you know. Sam's that guy that.
So what is his job then? If Cam is calling the shots, what's Sam's role in all of this and this monumental win?
Sam's role is to talk about the GDR, Nissan GDR, and the Audi RS6 that he's got in the garage, and I think downplay what's actually going on in front of them. Talk about the fishing. I just think he's there to take the pressure away. Cam's pretty cool, and I mean, you watch him and he's pretty cool, calm and collected. You can see that in his demeanour, but he gets down on himself. If you see how he reacted when he made that decision, because he made that decision to hit that shot when he made double bogey, you can see that, you know, he banged his club into the ground and, you know, pretty much called himself a mug, I suppose, in his own mind. But he's had to take that on himself, and then it's about distracting him, I suppose, because it's always about the next shot, isn't it?
Massive payday, right? $2.5 million US. So what does a winning caddy get?
Yeah, probably close to 400,000 New Zealand dollars, I would think. Not bad, eh? 4 days' work.
A lot of stress, but not bad, as you point out.
Yeah.
Look, we cannot finish this conversation without talking about the hair, right? Cam. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I've never met Cam, but I sort of feel as though I know a bit about the bloke and how he ticks. He's a genuine, I don't like to use the word, but probably an Aussie bogan. You know, like he loves his cars. As I said before, he's got, you know, his Nissan GTR and his Audi RS6. I think he's got a Lambo now. When he made the top 20 in the world, he shouted himself a Lamborghini. He just loves his cars. He's got a boat parked out the front of his house that gets lifted out of the water, and they love their fishing. I think that's probably why he's so settled. He loves his life, which then I think when you're in a good space on the course, it's a big help, eh?
Yeah, and I mean, with all that here and all those flash cars, perfect. Wind the window down, bit of a breeze, your locks behind you as you're motoring along in Florida. What a life,
That would be him. That would be him.
Do you reckon it's a bit of a Samson and Delilah kind of situation? You don't want him to cut the hair, something bad could go wrong.
Oh, I think he's going too good this year to cut it. Why would you change something? It's unreal.
And that is David Pollock from the Parapara Umu Beach Golf Club. It is 26 minutes to 6, and that means it's time for the business news. Kia mau tonu mai, you're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. Ko taku hoa e nai ko Nicholas Poynton, who joins me in the studio. So, Nicholas, let's talk about the solid report from the services sector, kind of pushing back about the recession narrative.
Yeah, the recession fears. That was the main takeaway from the BNZ Bank's latest survey of the services sector, otherwise known as the Performance of Services Index, or the PSI. The reason why we pay attention to this particular survey is that the services sector makes up about 2/3 of economic activity in New Zealand, and this latest survey, the index, the key headline number there rose a mere 0.1 points over the past month. But the encouraging sign was that we've now had 2 months in a row where the services sector has been expanding above its long-term average, and that's been underpinned by healthy readings and things like new orders, employment and sales. However, there are those familiar culprits which are weighing on the minds of many businesses, things like COVID absenteeism and supply chain disruptions. Not many signs as to when those things will begin to ease, but BNZ Bank says, while there are some patchy elements to this report, after that first quarter contraction we saw at the beginning of the year, they've sort of come to the view now that another quarter of contraction, which would trigger the technical definition of a recession, is appearing unlikely given that the strength they've seen in these past two reports. They say we're starting to see some signs that there was some underlying strength in the economy in the months between the 3 months ended June. Whether they're right, we won't find out until September. That's the strange way these GDP figures come out. There is a significant lag time, and when they do come out, when they are made public, they'll already be in the history books. They won't be relevant because we would have finished the third quarter by then. So, and what we already know now is that things can change really quickly, be it the effects of spikes in COVID cases, absenteeism, ongoing supply chain disruptions, inflation still running really high. The Economist saying today that it's going to take a long time for it to begin to ease. That's all going to flow through into things like discretionary spending in the economy. So there may still be some headwinds gathering in the months ahead.
Okay, let's talk about Vodafone, and it's joining Spark in selling off a large stake of its cell towers. Why and who to? Yeah,
this is all the rage in the telco sector. A couple of Australian companies have done it. As you mentioned, Spark's done it. The rationale behind it is that cell towers they're a critical piece of the telco infrastructure, but they're what are considered passive assets. They don't necessarily generate much by way of revenue, and they also require a large chunk of money to continue to update them, invest in them, maintain them. So there's been this trend recently, and it's what Vodafone has jumped on, and about why not just take all your cell towers, put them in a subsidiary, divest them or sell a large stake to some fund manager and then lease them back. And for the telco, what they stand to gain from that is they still get access to these cell towers that they need to run their telecommunications network, but they've also freed up a whole chunk of cash, and they don't necessarily have to commit much cash to maintaining those assets over the long term. And that's exactly what Vodafone's done. They sold an 80% stake in its cell towers to a British-based investment fund as well as a Canadian fund, about 80% for $1.7 billion. And what those fund managers get is a stable income over the next 20 years that by way of Vodafone through leasing out these towers to them. And remember, Vodafone, its half shareholder is Infratil, that's the diversified infrastructure investor. With this huge chunk of cash, they've got plenty of options about what they can do with it. They can either look to invest in Vodafone's network into more profitable parts of it. Maybe they could look at Infratil. They're always on the acquisition trail. They may look to some other businesses they want to add to their portfolio, or they may look at creative ways to return that value back to shareholders. Regardless, the market liked this announcement today. Infratil's shares rose 1.4% or 11 cents to $8.09 a share.
Okay, Nicholas, skates on. Let's do the rest of the markets.
So the NZX shrugged off that higher than expected inflation figure, gaining 41 points, taking taking it to 11,164. The dollar trading at 61.6 US cents, 90.6 Australian, and 51.8 pence.
Thanks, Nicholas. Ka kite. Nicholas Poynton there with our business news. And house construction costs are through the roof. Today's inflation figures revealed that the price of a new build is up 18% on the same time last year. Now, that's on top of everyday essentials like the cost of petrol, up 32% over the same period. David Kelly from the Master Builders Association is on the line. David, did you choke on your flat white when you heard that? 18%?
No, because we knew that it was around about that level already, Lisa. It's pretty frightening, isn't it?
Yeah,
But,
so how and why did it get that bad?
Yeah, so the main ones, trying to break it down, products are the obvious ones. So there was a report out by EBOS about 3 months ago that estimated the average price increase for products over the last 12 months has been 34%, so that's huge. Labour costs, because we've got a supply and demand imbalance, and some of the minimum wage issues have pushed up labour. There's some of the others that I think I heard from someone earlier, like transport, petrol costs, etc. But one I think that's possibly not that appreciated that much is just the cost of delay. And there are a whole lot of delays in the system, whether it's from products or consenting or customers trying to get approval for loans. And the cost of delay means that whereas you might have, I'll just pick a number, 6 months for a build, if it's going to take you another 2 to 3 months, all of those prices go up during that time. The builder doesn't have the cash flow, but they've still got to cover all of their overheads.
So when you break it down like that and you say that product up about 34%, what does that tell us? Does that tell us that we do not have enough competition in the market for building products?
That may be true for some products, but a lot of it is passed on from overseas. So we're still importing raw materials from overseas. We've still got a lot of product from overseas that have international transport costs. And then the product suppliers themselves also have their costs. So the report that was done, and I guess they're taking it from the product suppliers, saying that their costs went up by 36%, I think. So they're claiming that they're absorbing some of that cost. I think a lot of this is international. I'm not sure that just increased competition will make a massive difference. Certainly not in the short term. That might be a longer term issue, though, that we need to address. What's
the average price per square metre for a new build? Can you put a number on it, David?
No, look, sorry, I don't have those numbers. And they vary quite considerably depending on, what sort of level of specification you get.
Yeah,
So sorry, I don't have those. I could come back to you, but sorry, I just don't have those off the top of my head. Are
we actually producing economic houses, if you see what I mean, or are we just at the other end of the market? Everything costs the same, or do we have low-cost builds, and are we innovating to get that?
I think there are some low costs, but are we innovating enough? No, I don't think so. I don't think that we're particularly productive as a sector, and I put that in both residential and commercial.
Why not?
And, it's just the way we go around building. We don't standardise to the same degree that many other countries do. Now, partly that's an issue of size of the market, but traditionally people tend to want to customise their homes. So we don't have a lot of standardisation. Some companies do that, but not to the same degree that I think we could. So I think there's quite a complex issue. I think there's also one of the areas that I think could make a bit of a difference in terms of productivity, which is our whole consenting system, that it's not working and it hasn't worked for a number of years. And so we're talking to the government about how we could use technology to speed that up, how you could look at good quality builders and designers and give them a much faster
But the building sector always says that, David, and you've identified a significant chunk of the cost is product and also labour. So therefore, arguably, raising productivity and innovation could make a significant difference here, but it's not happening.
No, it's not. And that's something we need to look at seriously and have consistent policies over a period of time. The other thing, Lisa, that's really important is we have this thing that I'm sure you've heard called boom-bust. It's massively impactful on the sector. So if we think about just how big that is, during the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009, we went from 33 1,000 building consents down to 13,000. 25% of people in the sector lost their job. Now, they're not sitting around, and we didn't train anyone for about 3 years. So when we start again, we've got people who are underqualified, who are not productive, and we're just not thinking about how do we have a longer-term sustainable sector. That's where you get innovation, because people will say it's worth investing in this sector. So it's a bit more than just looking at products, it's thinking about the whole system.
David, we're out of time, but I want a quick answer from you on this one. If you were building a house then, how much would you put aside for contingency now? What percentage?
I'd be putting aside 20% plus.
Appreciate your time. That is David Kelly from the Master Builders Association. It is about 5:45 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Homai or whakaaro, we would love your feedback on anything you've heard on the program this evening. Just talking there about the construction of new houses, up 18% in a year. Wow. Are you stuck in a renovation or a build? Let us know your thoughts on that. Text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or you can email us checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Let's get to the headlines. Anea iwi mina pita pita kōrero.
Tēnā koe, Lisa. The director of the Salvation Army's Social Policy and Parliamentary Unit told Checkpoint the organisation is seeing a huge increase in those who can't afford rent. New figures from Stats NZ show inflation has risen 7.3% over the last year, a 32-year high. Ian Hutson says targeted government assistance, such as the accommodation supplement, is out of step with the cost of living. The Transport Agency says there are wind warnings in place throughout the South Island and heavy rain is forecast across Westland and the Main Divide overnight. The agency is advising drivers to avoid travelling in places where conditions could be dangerous. Head of ED at Wairarapa Hospital, Dr Norman Gray, says staffing numbers are averaging half full currently and the pressure on the health system is catastrophic. Over the weekend, the emergency department and general ward at Wairarapa had just 2 staff on deck at times. Huge waves that struck the Cook Islands over the weekend are expected to hit the Pāingoa again in the coming days. An Auckland testing station is seeing a huge spike in demand for free rat tests and masks after the government made rat tests available for everyone, regardless of symptoms, last Thursday. And President Volodymyr Zelensky of the Ukraine has sacked his security chief and top prosecutor amid accusations officials have been collaborating with Russia. He says more than 60 former employees are now working against Ukraine in Russian-occupied areas. Those are the headlines. Looking at traffic, as you heard in those headlines, strong winds are affecting the country, especially motorists heading over the Rimutaka Hill in Wellington and further south in Marlborough, Canterbury, the West Coast and coastal Otago. Waka Kotahi advises drivers in the south to delay your journey tonight if you can. I'll have the latest news and weather for you at 6.
Kia ora rā e ho. The Greens are demanding student allowances be hiked and made universal after a survey found 2/3 of respondents are struggling to buy food and other necessities. The report, pulled together with the student unions, comes on the same day New Zealand recorded record inflation, a 32-year high of 7.3%. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Craig McCulloch.
Everyone knows the cost of living crisis, but university students know it better than most.
My whole student loan goes to rent. Without StudyLink and having a job, I definitely wouldn't be able to survive.
I worked 2 part-time jobs to afford my accommodation.
Groceries are insane. It's they scan maybe 10 or so items and you're already pushing $100.
You can see it's sort of occurring on an international scale, but it's still not, you don't have to like it.
Their trials and travails have now been documented, collected by the Green Party and student unions in a survey of some 4,500 students. The finished product, a 50-page report outlining the state of studenthood in 2022.
These facts are now here in black and white.
For the Green MP Chloe Swarbrick, the findings are sad but not surprising. 2/3 of respondents report regularly struggling to afford food, clothing and healthcare. Those who live in shared flats spend an average of 56% of their weekly income on rent. The international marker for affordability is 30%.
Things are markedly worse today than they were in the past, and there's a number of current politicians who benefited from those past structures.
This should never be a rite of passage.
Sam Blackmore heads the University Students Association. He is tired of government inaction. Together with the Greens, he's calling for a major boost to student allowances, as well as making it available to all. Currently, single students living away from their parents are eligible for $280 a week, unless their parents earn too much. Last year, the association calculated that an increase of $100 a week, plus universal access, would cost taxpayers just over $2.5 billion a year. And Sam Blackmore says it is well worth it.
Students remain some of the most vulnerable people in our communities, borrowing money to live in an environment that makes them sick through mould and cold, all while eating 2-minute noodles.
So many in the front bench at the moment from our government are proudly former Student Association presidents who seem to have forgotten the positions that they once held and advocated for.
The Education Minister, Chris Hipkins, is one of those former student reps. He declined to be interviewed, but in a statement said the government had done far more for students in the past 5 years than the previous government. He notes allowances went up $50 a week in 2018 and another $25 this year. He also cites the first-year fees-free scheme, but neglects to mention Labour's initial promise to roll it out to cover 3 years. Alice Mander, the head of the National Disabled Students Association, is underwhelmed.
It is time to actually listen to the voices of students, especially disabled, Māori and Pasifika students, who are telling us that they are not experiencing the barrier-free education which they are constantly promised.
We've worked with all of the student bodies across this country to showcase the power of students to build that solidarity, and we'll be coming for him if he doesn't do it.
A stark warning to the minister with an election year just around the corner.
It's 10 to 6. Kia mau tonu mai. Stay with us. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. Emergency department nurses across Sydney walked off the job this morning as the latest COVID wave puts pressure on emergency departments and respiratory wards. Across the country, more than 4,500 patients are in hospital with COVID. But unlike previous waves, it's hoped increased vaccination rates will mean intensive care wards are spared. The ABC's Isabel Rowe reports.
What do we want? Ratios! When do we want them? Now! What do we want? Ratios! When do we want them? Now!
As the night shift ended at Westmead Hospital in Western Sydney this morning, dozens of emergency nurses marched out of the building in protest.
1, 2, 4, on the floor! 1, 2, 3, DVD! 1, 2, 4, on the floor!
This is going over everybody's head. No one seems to care.
Our department is unsafe. Our nurses are fearful for the patients that we're providing care to.
Nurses walked off the job at Blacktown Hospital in Western Sydney too. Shay Candish from the Nurses and Midwives Association says staff shortages in emergency are unsustainable.
We need for the government to implement ratios shift by shift right now. We can't have the New South Wales community suffering like it is. People should be able to access quality health care. They should not have to wait hours and hours for treatment in emergency departments.
New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet insists his state's health system is more under control than others.
We're already seeing in Victoria and Queensland today that non-urgent elective surgery has once again been paused. We haven't done that in this state.
Emergency departments in Queensland are also under pressure, with 6% of staff on sick leave, prompting this request from the state's Health Minister, Yvette Darth.
Those pressures are going to get worse. I ask people that if you can see a GP, instead of coming to an ED, if it's not an emergency, do so, please.
Dr Kim Hansen from the Australasian College for Emergency Medicine is worried that finding new emergency doctors and nurses will be difficult.
I think emergency medicine's become slightly less attractive since the pandemic started 2 years ago, plus still a lot of ramping and access block, meaning it's just harder to do our job properly.
While emergency departments and respiratory wards are seeing an influx of COVID patients, intensive care units are comparatively quiet. In Victoria, there are currently 35 COVID patients in ICUs across the state, with just 9 needing a ventilator. That's much lower than during the Delta wave in October last year, when on some days there were more than 100 Victorians ventilated. Today at St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney, there are just a couple of COVID patients in ICU. The hospital's intensive care director is Dr Priya Nair.
The symptoms this time around with this variant do seem to be more upper respiratory and less severe, if you like. It's hard to predict, though, because, of course, there's a large immunocompromised population out there who might get quite sick. But certainly we're not seeing the kind of intensive care severity that we've seen previously.
She says rather than patient numbers, this latest wave of COVID will present a challenge for staffing levels.
It's the impact on staffing. At any time, we have about 10% of our nursing staff furloughed because they're COVID positive. Same with medical and allied health staff. So I think over winter, that's what's going to be more of an issue rather than the case numbers themselves, I hope anyway.
So are you comfortable, given that staffing issue, if ICU numbers do rise, will you be able to meet that demand, do you think?
We have had the chance to put a few mechanisms into place, given that this has been going on for a couple of years. A large number of our staff have already had COVID. Fortunately, none were severe. But hopefully they won't keep catching it again and again. Having had it once, there would be some level of immunity, as well as they're all completely vaccinated.
No state or territory has indicated it will bring back any restrictions to combat the rise in cases. Public health officials are urging people to wear face masks indoors and keep up to date with vaccinations.
Inflation's a problem around the world and has hit a 40-year high in the United States with soaring prices, forcing Americans to make brutal decisions. And as CNN's Gabe Cohen reports, for many it means more than just digging into their savings.
It's huge. It's every week.
Rosita Klein now searches several grocery stores for the cheapest options, an inflation adjustment, as her husband battles Parkinson's, making these price hikes far more painful.
We are using our saving.
Are you nervous about the future?
Yes, of course.
Inflation in America surged in June, with some of the steepest price hikes from June of last year in places like Baltimore, Miami, Atlanta, Phoenix, and Alaska. The biggest drivers, gasoline up 60% in a year, and groceries up 12%, plus the largest monthly rise in rent since 1986. All of those price hikes are straining Karen Martin, a 911 operator near Tampa, Florida, and a single mom, raising two sons while making less than $20 an hour.
I'm not making ends meet. I'm not making it. I'm setting my savings. I get paid tomorrow, and already my whole paycheck is spoken for. And it's the first time in my life I've had to apply for food stamps because I don't know how we're going to continue eating groceries.
Consumer sentiment hit a record low last month, as new polling shows 42% of Americans are struggling to remain where they are financially, nearly double from a year ago, and 85% think the economy is getting worse.
Especially after COVID, nobody has money for anything, and now everything goes up higher and higher.
It's forcing families to make brutal decisions.
It's like, what do you want to eat or you want to drive?
Some foregoing bills or medications, many others turning to assistance programs like food banks.
We have seen skyrocketing numbers of people needing food, and unfortunately, we're not getting the same level in donations that we used to.
I try not to let it get to me, I just go day by day.
On top of brutal price hikes, Bonita Wesley expects to face a sizable rent hike in the months ahead. Would you be able to afford to stay?
No. Oh, no. No, indeed. Not at all. I probably would have to move in with my kids or whatever. But no, not by myself, no.
By one estimate, the typical American household is now spending nearly $500 more every month on the same goods and services. So even as gas prices dip, families are eating a lot of surging costs, with so many of them telling me their salaries just aren't keeping up.
It's the story almost everyone's got an opinion on, what's gone wrong with the All Blacks and what's going to happen with head coach Ian Foster. The All Blacks cancelled his press conference yesterday after the side's first series loss since 1994. NZR boss Mark Robinson released a statement labelling the series loss against Ireland as unacceptable. But so far there's no word out of the All Blacks camp about changes, if any, before the Rugby Championship gets underway next month. So our cameraman Angus Drever hit the streets and met some pretty strong reckons among All Blacks fans.
What were you thinking, New Zealand Rugby? It's not Foster's fault, it's your fault. You put him into that position. He wasn't the right person with the right team for the job. Get him out now and get the person or the duo that are going to do the job for us in.
They could have done better. We so could have won. Like, what the heck is going on? The old All Blacks would have been... They would have sassed Ireland. And every other team...
I don't know, the Irish team played really well, and we just did nothing for the entire first half, and then finally came out fizzing, and it was too late at that point. So, and everyone's sort of blaming it on Foster and bits and pieces, which is not ideal, but you can't blame Ian Foster for dropping 50 balls or missing 100 tackles and some pieces like that. So, yeah, it's sort of, they're just not up to it at the moment.
Best bit of advice there, we should have sassed them more. Checkpoint requested an interview with Mark Robinson today, but he declined. We also asked for an interview with Ian Foster, but we didn't hear back. So let's get to some of your feedback now on the cost of living. Lots of messages from you. One person says, inflating your car tyres to 36 PSI means you get more mileage. Okay, that's a good practical tip. Someone else says, who owns the houses that put the rents up so high? Is it the government? Why must the government reward wealthy homeowners by subsidising overpriced rents in a housing crisis made by the private market? A lot of you are getting in touch in relation to this and our interview with the Salvation Army spokesperson. You're saying housing supplements go to the landlord's pocket. It's responsible for the increased rents.
RNZ News at 6. Good evening. Kia ora tātou. Ko iwi Ashton tēnei. The government's being told it must urgently review the help it's giving to low-income people struggling to pay rent. Inflation figures out today show the cost of living has hit a 32-year high on the back of increased fuel, food and housing. Rents are up more than 4% on a year ago, and the Salvation Army spokesperson, Ian Hutson, told Checkpoint in places like Porirua they've doubled.
So what's happening in places like Porirua, it's not the only place, but people are now having their income completely swallowed up by the housing costs.
Ian Hutson says the accommodation supplement is about 6 years out of date and should be doubled in some regions. The Greens are calling for a big boost to student allowances after their survey found 2/3 of respondents are struggling to buy food and other necessities. The party teamed up with student unions around the country to survey more than 4,500 students on their well-being. Green MP Chloe Swarbrick says the findings are black and white and prove the need for action. Of those who responded, 2/3 reported they didn't have enough money to buy food, clothing, healthcare or other basics.
My whole student loan goes to rent. Without StudyLink and having a job, I definitely wouldn't be able to survive.
I work 2 part-time jobs to afford my accommodation.
Groceries are insane. It's they scan maybe 10 or so items and you're already pushing $100.
The survey also found that students living in shared flats on average spent more than half their weekly income on rent. Health staff at Wairarapa Hospital say pressure on the system can't be called a crisis anymore, it's a catastrophe. The emergency department and general ward had just 2 staff on deck at times over the weekend, with just 1 nurse in ED last night. Head of ED, Dr Norman Gray, says staffing numbers are averaging half full currently. He says they're not being believed by the government when they call for help. Dr Gray says it's simple, the hospital needs more staff. The Waitangi Tribunal has heard there are stark discrepancies with claimants being able to take treaty-based claims. A part of the Justice Outcome Inquiry started today, looking at claimant funding and legal aid for progressing claims. Claimant Maurice Lant says access to resourcing and funding to be part of proceedings is inequitable and makes for a broken system.
I believe it's dysfunctional, and a structure that's dysfunctional cannot represent or offer my people that fair representation in terms of the treaty.
This part of the inquiry is set down for the week in Porirua. A leading figure in the entertainment industry is facing a raft of sexual violence charges against 9 different victims. Open Justice lists them as 10 charges of indecent assault, 4 of rape, and 6 charges relating to sexual violation or attempted sexual violation. The North Island man, who can't be identified due to an interim name suppression order, has pleaded not guilty to all charges. The alleged offending is said to have occurred throughout the North Island, including Auckland, Waikato, Bay of Plenty and Gisborne, dating back as far as 2012. The man last appeared in court last May, but his charging documents have only just been released to open justice. His trial is scheduled for May 2023. Sri Lanka's acting president has declared a state of emergency amid ongoing unrest and a devastating economic crisis. His predecessor, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, fled overseas last week to escape a popular uprising. Our correspondent, Sriyoshi Mukherjee, reports.
A government notice issued on Monday by the Office of Sri Lanka's interim president said that the state of emergency was in the interests of public security and the protection of public order. The country's parliament will meet on Wednesday to select a new president. Ranil Wickremesinghe is a top contender to take over as leader following the resignation of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who fled to Singapore via the Maldives last week. But many Sri Lankans see Wickremesinghe as an ally of the Rajapaksa family and want him to step down as well.
Businesses disrupted by the Parliament occupation earlier this year have received some financial relief. 50 businesses have been granted between $2,000 and $30,000 each from a government and Wellington City Council fund, totalling nearly $1 million. Businesses that had a revenue drop of 50% or more during the 3-week protest were eligible to apply. Wellington City Council's Anna Calver says businesses in the area were forced to shut completely or had far fewer customers during the protest. The Transport Agency is warning South Island motorists to take extra care on the roads tonight as strong winds continue to batter the area. Waka Kotahi says crews are attending downed power lines and trees on roads throughout South and Mid-Canterbury, while dust clouds on some inland Canterbury highways are limiting visibility. The agency is advising drivers to avoid travelling in places where conditions could be dangerous. It says there are wind warnings throughout the South Island and heavy rain is forecast across Westland and the Main Divide overnight. Lines crews have been working to restore power to several thousand properties in Canterbury. And huge waves that struck the Cook Islands over the weekend are expected to hit the Pā'ingoa or the outer islands again in the coming days. Emergency Cook Islands Director John Strickland says nationwide alert notices will be issued to warn people of another swell expected to strike the southern area of Rarotonga on Tuesday, Cook Islands time, or Wednesday, New Zealand time. Mr Strickland says the clean-up operation is well underway on Rarotonga, clearing roads so further damage can be assessed. In sport, shot putter Tom Walsh says he's physically in good form, but he couldn't convert that into a medal at the World Athletics Championships. Walsh finished in fourth with a throw of 22.08 metres behind 3 Americans. Walsh says he was disappointed with the result.
I just wasn't really in the competition the whole time and just a bit pushy and not smooth and not like I throw when I throw well.
Jamaican sprinter Shelly-Ann Fraser-Price claimed a 5th World 100 metres title when she crushed as well the finish line in 10.67 seconds at the championships in Oregon. After breaking her Oceania and national records in the 100 metre heats, New Zealand sprinter Zoe Hobbs' 11.13 second run in the semi-finals wasn't fast enough to qualify for the final. And the Black Caps ramp up their preparation for this year's T20 World Cup with a series against Ireland, which starts in Belfast tomorrow morning. The New Zealanders have just completed a tight ODI series against the Irish, and they're expecting to be challenged again in the shortest format of the game. The Black Caps will also play T20 games against Scotland and the Netherlands, and captain Mitchell Satner says they have to make the most of this.
Yeah, I guess you kind of want to play as many games as you can leading into a World Cup, and you've got, I guess, an opportunity now to look at some other guys in the next couple of series if we want to kind of go that way. So it's exciting times, and we've obviously got a lot of cricket, before the World Cup, so there could be a little bit of rotation as well. But obviously, we want to win every game, and it starts tomorrow.
Wicketkeeper Dane Cleaver will make his Black Caps debut tomorrow. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, we speak to the team behind the feature film Shut Eye, a coming-of-age drama exploring the world of ASMR, or Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response, which is an online phenomenon where streamers use sound therapy to connect with audiences. And Mona Lynn Couto joins us once again with more Latin American music, tonight in historical Brazilian genre from the late 1960s known as Tropicalia. That's Nights with me, Karen Hay, in for Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
And we're funded through New Zealand On Air. You're back with Lisa Owen next on Checkpoint. Right now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Tuesday. From Northland to Taranaki, also for Coromandel, Bay of Plenty, Taupo and Taumarunui. Showers turning to rain from tomorrow afternoon with thunderstorms possible. From Gisborne to Wairarapa, also for Taihape, Whanganui and Manawatu. High clouds increasing, scattered rain is developing later tomorrow. Severe northwest gales are forecast for exposed parts of southern Wairarapa, easing tomorrow. From Horuwhenua to Wellington, also for Marlborough and Nelson, scattered showers turning to rain for a time tomorrow. Strong or gale northwesterlies, severe and exposed parts of Wellington and Marlborough, easing tomorrow. From Bulla to Fiordland, rain with heavy falls and thunderstorms, turning to showers in Fiordland tonight and elsewhere tomorrow morning or afternoon. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, periods of rain, mainly inland today with heavy falls near the main divide. Gale northwesterlies, severe in exposed places, easing from tonight. And for Reakohu, the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods. The time is 9 minutes past 6. I'll update you with the latest news headlines at 6:30.
Thanks, Evie. No mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint. Ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Scorching temperatures are causing wildfires, deadly heat stroke and mass evacuations across Europe. In Portugal, the government says more than 650 people, mostly elderly, have died in the past week. While in France, more than 14,000 have had to evacuate due to the fire. The BBC's Jessica Parker has more.
A constant battle being fought in Spain, Portugal, Greece and here in southwestern France, where in Gironde today it's driven people from their homes to shelter in the shade of an evacuation centre.
Ils sont venus une première fois pour me demander de partir.
They told me to leave, but I wanted to stay. So they came a second time and gave me 5 minutes to pack. I've been staying here since Wednesday afternoon.
Voilà.
She worries for her house and then spots something.
On a peur pour nos maisons. Regardez, Canadair.
Canadaires, water bombers flying towards her village of Cazaux. This road leads straight there. We go in with the fire service. It's a restricted zone. Smoke hangs like mist in the woods. An ever-shifting and growing adversary.
Alors oui, on voit une grande différence avec le réchauffement climatique.
We see a big difference with climate change. We can see that the soil has become drier and drier. For us, the wildfires are the most dangerous.
This road, which leads up to the evacuated village of Cazaux, is closed off, and what they're really trying to do here is stop the fire from spreading from this side of the road to this side of the road. But the winds have just picked up a little and we've been told we've got to leave. Wind and heat also made things worse at another blaze inland. Authorities said tonight the situation was deteriorating. This family from Germany has been sleeping outside. Their caravan left at the campsite. They had to flee.
Es ist einfach so eine Situation, du bist völlig überfordert.
It's completely overwhelming. You see these kinds of things on TV, but I never expected to get caught up in something like this myself.
It's hard work in the heat to keep blazes at bay that have already burned through over 100 square kilometres of forest across Gironde. Any brief moments of respite don't last for long.
And in breaking news, police have just put out a press release saying they are in attendance at a serious firearms incident in the Auckland suburb of Grey Lynn. They go on to say there is no information to suggest that there is any ongoing risk to the public, but more information will be provided as it comes to hand. So a serious firearms incident in the Auckland central suburb of Grey Lynn. The Australian golfer Cameron Smith has won the British Open at St Andrews, holding off crowd favourite Rory McIlroy. It's Smith's first major championship win and marks the first time an Aussie has won the title since Greg Norman in 1993. The ABC's Rachel Mealy has more.
Brilliant, quite brilliant. What a back nine.
With that, Cameron Smith entered the history books. He's the first Australian to win the title since Greg Norman in 1993, which also happens to be the year of his birth. Smith shot a final round 8 under 64 to surge to the top of the leaderboard.
I'll tell you what, Charlotte, it was excellent. Just amazing control he has over his emotions, over everything under this kind of pressure.
The win's a significant career breakthrough for the Queenslander, who took just 30 shots to complete the back nine, including saving par on the notorious 17th hole, where he opted to putt around the bunker known as the road hole.
Cam Smith for par then to maintain his one-shot lead.
Oh my goodness.
Cameron Smith says he's overwhelmed to look at the names on the trophy and see his own.
First and foremost, I want to thank the team back there, all their hard work, all the hard work we've done the last couple of years has really started to pay off, and this one definitely makes it worth it.
He was followed around the course throughout the day by a troop of loyal Australian fans.
Lastly, to you guys, the fans, had a lot of support out there, especially the Aussie guys. You guys really kept me going out there. Seemed like there was a lot of you guys out there, kept me plugging away, and this one's for Oz. Thanks, guys.
Ken Mackay is from Brisbane's Wantima Golf Course in Brendale. He says he's watched Cameron Smith's progress over many years and watched nervously throughout the night.
I don't know how he keeps his nerves of steel, because I was pretty much on the edge of my seat the whole night. And as it got closer and closer, I was trying to do everything I could not to wake the house up.
He says Cameron Smith is a humble, unassuming and worthy winner.
You hear all these stories about sports stars and stuff like that. He's really grounded. He's such a nice bloke. He always has been. He doesn't let things get to his head, and he's very giving of his time to both the members and the juniors at the club.
Cameron Smith is the 5th Australian to hold the famous claret jug aloft.
I'm definitely going to find out how many beers fit in this thing, that's for sure.
And it's 6:15. You're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Top Ukrainian officials have been accused of treason by President Volodymyr Zelensky. He sacked his security chief and top prosecutor amid accusations officials have been collaborating with Russia. He says more than 60 former employees are now working against Ukraine in Russian-occupied areas. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces have repelled Russian advances in Donetsk over the weekend. The BBC's Jonathan Beale reports on the human and psychological cost of the war.
Death can come quickly in the Donbass. The seconds it takes for a Russian shell to land. This time among the homes of ordinary people. Their elderly neighbour was killed. She shows us the badly wounded dog. Signs of normal life are disappearing fast. Slavyansk, the next city in Russia's sights. The exit's gathering pace. Staying is a roll of the dice.
I'm leaving because of the constant bombing, because we have to hide in cellars, because our houses explode. Everything is on fire. You can hear yourself, can't you? And this is everywhere.
Alexei deals with death all the time. He and his men recover the bodies of troops and civilians. On average, around 100 Ukrainian soldiers are dying each day. But he thinks the Russians are losing 3 times as many. though he's lost count of the bodies he's collected. This war is also taking its toll on him.
You're facing death all the time. Others can only imagine what it's like. It all catches up with you when you get home. That feeling when you're empty inside, that unfillable void.
There's little respite from the shelling. On average, the Russians are firing 20,000 rounds a day. Tina and Polina are medics on the front line. Tina's recently become a grandmother. She tears up when she mentions her family. And this is what they do, driving towards danger to save the lives of their comrades. For every soldier killed, many more are injured, though Tina's not allowed to say how many.
There are casualties almost every day, and not just one, sometimes many, sometimes a lot. But I cannot talk about this.
As COVID cases in Australia rise, residential aged care providers are warning the industry could be about to experience its worst period since the pandemic began. There are outbreaks in almost a third of facilities, and hundreds of elderly residents have died with COVID in the past 2 weeks. The ABC's Annie Guest reports.
Australia's elderly have been the worst hit by COVID, with almost 2,000 living in aged care facilities dying this year alone. Paul Sadler is the interim CEO of the Aged and Community Care Providers Association.
We're very concerned, based on the advice from the Chief Health Officer and other government sources, that we could see a wave of Omicron in aged care that will be as high as the wave back in January. In January, 2/3 of all aged care homes in Australia had active outbreaks.
The big fear for Paul Sadler is this will be worse than anything we've seen for the entire pandemic.
It could easily get higher. We are very concerned that we're going to go at least as high in terms of number of outbreaks as we did in January, and it could go beyond that level.
And that would set a new and dismal record.
That's correct. We are facing the risk now that we will have the worst outbreak affecting aged care since the beginning of the pandemic in 2020.
That must be an exhausting idea for aged care staff.
It's absolutely terrifying for the aged care staff.
The Federal Aged Care Minister, Annika Wells, says she's meeting more than 1,000 providers today to talk through the winter plan for nursing homes. It includes 4th vaccine doses, better access to antiviral medication, infection control training, and communication between providers and government. Geriatrician Joseph Ibrahim says little of that is evident on the ground.
What I think we're seeing is what we predicted months, if not years ago, that when the restrictions around COVID were relaxed, that it would be the most vulnerable populations that would carry the weight of the illness and deaths that we're seeing. And I think that we're now coming to live that.
Professor Ibrahim is also the head of the Health and Ageing Research Unit at Monash University, and he's urging the community to help protect the vulnerable by wearing masks and getting their 4th vaccine dose.
We need to think more than just ourselves. The quality of our individual lives depends on the quality of the life of our community, that we can't do things by ourselves.
The federal government is urging states and territories to keep mask mandates in aged care. But Professor Ibrahim says it's not broad enough.
And I don't understand why we haven't gone back to a mask mandate. Wearing a mask doesn't really hurt anyone. It's not that difficult to do. And there's a long-established evidence now that it reduces the risk of infections.
Victoria is among the jurisdictions to have already ruled out community-wide mask mandates, saying there's evidence they may be less effective at changing behaviours.
A preliminary report into a mass shooting at a Texas primary school in May has found systemic failures in the police response. 19 children and 2 teachers were killed when an 18-year-old gunman opened fire at the school in the town of Uvalde. Nearly 400 officers rushed to the Texas primary school, yet it took more than an hour to confront and kill the shooter. The BBC's Mark LaBelle has more.
19 children and 2 teachers killed amid systematic failures and poor decision-making. That's the damning conclusion from the most exhaustive probe of why it took nearly 400 police and other officers more than an hour to confront and kill an 18-year-old gunman here in May. In what Texan legislators described as a chaotic scene marked by a lack of clear leadership and sufficient urgency. Their report found that law enforcement responders failed to adhere to their active shooter training and failed to prioritise saving the lives of innocent victims over their own safety, blaming the officers' lackadaisical approach.
The people of Uvalde before this, they felt it couldn't happen here. They felt that. That's the false sense of security I worry about. I think some of the same systems that we found here that failed that day are across the entire state and country.
That false sense of security started at the Robb Elementary School's gates. The 5-foot-tall exterior school fence couldn't impede the gunman. Exterior and interior doors were unlocked or propped open due to non-compliance by school personnel, allowing the gunman to easily enter through an unlocked door.
I promise you, you do not want this to happen to you. I promise you.
Last week, relatives of school children gunned down and seriously injured called for an assault weapons ban, horrified by new footage showing it took officers over 70 minutes to confront the perpetrator. The findings suggest the attacker fired around 100 of approximately 142 rounds before any officer entered the school, but adds that victims could have survived if they had not had to wait so long to be rescued.
Health officials and experts in Australia are trying to work out what to do with tens of millions of COVID vaccines the country no longer needs. The government purchased roughly 255 million vaccine doses, but only about 100 million have been administered or donated overseas. It's been criticised for overbuying, especially with poorer countries going without. The ABC's Tom Lowry reports.
The first few months of the pandemic were filled with uncertainty. Australia's borders were closed to the world and vaccines were being developed, but no one quite knew what would work and how much might be needed. So, like a lot of wealthier countries, Australia started buying up big. Orders were placed with AstraZeneca and Pfizer, then Novavax and Moderna. About 250 million doses would eventually be purchased, roughly 10 doses for every Australian.
Australia really participated in a bigger trend that we've seen worldwide of wealthy countries buying up far more doses of COVID-19 vaccines than they needed early on in the pandemic.
Dr. Deborah Gleeson is an associate professor in public health at La Trobe University. She says wealthy countries buying up so many vaccine doses early hampered efforts to get the vaccines shared with low-income countries.
We're in a situation now where 12 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines have been administered around the world, but the vaccination rate in low-income countries is still only around 20%.
Australia's last vaccine to be approved and rolled out was Novavax. By the time the vaccine hit pharmacies and GPs, 95% of Australians over 16 were already fully vaccinated. Of the 51 million doses ordered, only about 161,000 have been administered. Health Minister Mark Butler has already ordered a review of Australia's vaccine arrangements, to be led by former Health Department Secretary Jane Hutson.
If it does turn out that we have a surplus, then I'd want to have a range of options in front of us as to what to do with any surplus vaccines we were contractually required to take.
Professor Brendan Crabb, who leads the Australian Global Health Alliance, says the government's approach to vaccine orders was understandable.
In the emergency of a pandemic, it makes sense to have given ourselves a lot of options.
But he says that doesn't mean there are not lessons to learn.
We do need to review that very closely and decide how we can do it better next time, because there's nothing more tragic than to literally throw out life-saving vials of vaccine.
Talks are underway with Pfizer and Moderna about buying new Omicron-targeting boosters. Dr. Gleeson says it's important wealthy countries like Australia don't approach buying those vaccines the same way.
We'll see the same sorts of bottlenecks in production and the same sorts of inequitable sharing happening with those vaccines unless wealthy countries are prepared to really think about what they've been doing and start doing things differently.
Finally tonight, a nutty Colorado man has broken an unusual record. Bob Salem pushed a peanut up Pikes Peak with a tiny shovel strapped to his face. Yep, you heard right. The 13 miles, that's almost 21 kilometres, took him the best part of a week. Riley Carroll spoke with Bob after he reached the summit.
A feat accomplished by only a handful of people in the world.
You know, if you got a goal, it does feel good when you finish it.
Early Friday morning, Bob crossed the proverbial finish line, marking the end of a week-long journey.
Thank you. Oh.
We have a jewelry box for the peanut.
All right.
The peanut pusher in good spirits and his body also faring well.
I'm surprisingly in really good shape. I don't feel sore or anything. It's just the dehydration sort of kicked my butt a little bit. And I know I lost some weight. So I know I lost a lot of weight.
Bob's advice to the next person nutty enough for this push, don't do it alone.
Have help. Bring lots of water. Really, that's all they need. Looking for a peanut. There it is.
Bob set the new record Friday for this out-of-the-box endeavor. Letters from the city of Manitou Springs and Colorado Springs to congratulate this local icon on his one-of-a-kind victory.
Those are awesome. Thank you. That's awesome.
Now, Bob is heading home and taking a well-deserved nap. Though he may have had his fill and never dream of a peanut again, his memories from the mountain will not soon be forgotten.
Got my initials, 2022 and PPPP, Pikes Peak Peanut Push.
Man, that really has to be seen to be believed. Pushing a peanut up a hill. Pretty much all we've got time for this evening. Quick bit of feedback from you. A lot of you agree. Force landlords to pay the accommodation supplement through a tax. This is on the rising cost of paying for rentals. The Late News team's going to keep you updated throughout the night. And if you missed anything from the show, you can always find Checkpoint on Spotify, Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. Ko te kaupapa tuatahi a pōpō. And tomorrow from 5 a.m, first up is going to check out soaring inflation, speaking to Shamabeel Jacob, so do tune in.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Kia ora tātou, koiwi Ashton tēnei. The police are at what they're calling a serious firearms incident in the Auckland suburb of Grey Lynn. They say there's no information to suggest any ongoing risk to the public. An emergency coordination centre has been set up in Canterbury to deal with the storm currently hitting the region. The weather's expected to worsen overnight and people are urged to prepare their properties if it's safe to do so. And the Greens are calling for a big boost to student allowances after their survey found 2/3 of respondents are struggling to buy food and other necessities. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather is at 7.
Hi, Ross, a lovely bunch of coconut. Listen to sports on the special report. It's business. It's business time. You was hard for the money. I want
money. All of the important sounds are in your ears. Brought to you by First Up from 5 a.m. weekdays on RNZ National.
Ta-da, at 29 minutes to 7. Karen Hay in for Brian Crump this week as he takes a break. Time for trending now. And firstly, how did New Zealand end up with just 2 big supermarket players? And can the government's changes really shake things up? Sarah Robson has the detail.
Do you reckon you're paying too much at the supermarket?
The weekly supermarket shop probably fills most of us with dread. But
last year between us we spent more than $22 billion at supermarkets and grocery stores. That's more money than we earned from dairy exports.
But our supermarket duopoly is in for a shake-up.
The government has put New Zealand supermarkets on notice. It's determined to break up the duopoly in the grocery market and to reduce the bill for your weekly shop.
How did we get to this point?
The Commerce Commission report found New Zealand grocery prices appear high compared to international standards and suppliers suffer from a major power imbalance.
Kia ora, I'm Sarah Robson, and today on The Detail, the Commerce Commission's looked into it and the government says it'll act. But how did New Zealand end up with a supermarket sector dominated by just 2 big players? And will breaking it up actually make any difference to what we're paying for groceries at the checkout? Why do people get so het up about prices at the supermarket? Why do we care so much?
Well, I guess it's because it's unavoidable, right? Everyone's got a shop.
John Duffy is the Chief Executive of Consumer New Zealand.
And for most people, the supermarket is the place you got to go to. There are places around New Zealand where there is no other alternative than to head to your local supermarket. And sometimes there's only one supermarket, so, it's a regional monopoly for that supermarket brand. And, I think there's a couple of things that spring to mind. Firstly, people resent feeling like they're being ripped off when it comes to food prices. And secondly, particularly when it comes to homegrown produce, and I'm thinking, milk, cheese, that sort of thing, when people see, the eye-watering cost of those products, people, feel a little bit of resentment that we're a land that produces so much dairy, yet we're paying so much for those products.
Last year, the Fair Go program sent TVNZ's overseas correspondents out to pick up some basic groceries.
2 litres of milk. $3.54 here, same as in the States roughly, and Australia, Struth, $2.48. And that just leaves our lad in London.
And that cost £1.09, so just over $2 New Zealand for a 2 litre milk.
It's important to separate the dairy question, which is New Zealand choosing to trade on a global market and New Zealanders paying the same prices as consumers overseas, versus just how generally more expensive our groceries are in New Zealand for other types of products that aren't involved in, international trade, like products that are sold through Fonterra, for example. And that's down to, as the Commerce Commission has recently concluded in its market study, down to a lack of competition in our supermarket sector.
We've got one of the most concentrated grocery markets in the world. And our export market is huge. And that can really push up prices at home too.
Is it as simple as that? We're paying more for the basics than people in the UK or Australia because we've got this supermarket duopoly?
It's one of the main factors, so not the only factor. I mean, we need to be realistic here. When we're importing products, we're a small market at the end of the world, so it costs money to get products here. But we do produce a lot ourselves that is sold domestically. There's a balance to be struck there, but the lack of competition, the profits of the supermarkets are key factors in why we pay more than other countries for our groceries.
But it wasn't always like this.
It's probably useful to start at the beginning of the end, is a good way of putting it, which is the last of a long line of mergers and acquisitions that occurred through the 80s and 90s. And the last brand left standing that wasn't in the current duopoly was Foodtown.
These are the hands of a Foodtown butcher. Despite our meat being a cut above the rest, our size is such that the price to you is often well below our opposition's best.
Listeners that are my age will remember Foodtown, and they'll probably remember when there was Big Fresh.
At Big Fresh, customers discover country quality, country freshness, and genuine value for money.
And there was Right Price and Price Chopper.
Small town anecdote for you. Growing up in Fielding in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a Right Price, a Price Chopper, and a New World.
All sorts of other brands out there in the supermarket industry. And when, brands like Foursquare were independently owned.
Foursquare, come on in. We know how you feel. Come on in.
And over the years, what is now the duopoly chipped away at that and acquired and merged. And eventually, in the early 2000s, the last brand standing was Foodtown. They, the company that is now Woolworths, which was called Progressives at the time, Progressive Enterprises, applied to the Commerce Commission to purchase Foodtown. That was, it's quite a long and convoluted story, but it was initially approved, and then it wasn't, and then it went to court. It was appealed, and it went back and forth through the courts, but eventually the merger went ahead, and that was the beginning of the end. That was the beginning of the status quo, which is New Zealand being served, its grocery sector being served by a duopoly.
Find savings down every aisle at New World. Get great prices that last with everyday value.
Our national supermarket is Pack and Save, proudly New Zealand owned and operated.
Over 300,000 Kiwis shop at Countdown every day.
And over the last 20 years, we've seen those businesses consolidate and vertically integrate, which means they've bought into the wholesale chain as well. So they now are fully vertically integrated, and in some instances are even supplying themselves through owning fishing fleets and things like that. So right from, the moment a fish is caught through to the moment it is scanned at the checkout, that's fully owned in one case by one entity. And, when you own the entire supply chain, it makes it a lot easier to control the prices that are charged through that supply chain. And that's what we end up wearing at the supermarket checkout.
But we have got competition, right? It is a duopoly. We've got two big players competing with each other. Why isn't that enough?
Well, the Commerce Commission has described competition as I'm paraphrasing here, but muted. There are various activities that the Commerce Commission's highlighted in its market study that has made it difficult for real competition to take root. I mean, they may have competed more vigorously early on, but what we see now is through supply chains, through the requirements that are placed on suppliers, it's very rare to see a special at one supermarket chain and then not see it repeated, in very short order at the other supermarket chain, right? So to say that the offerings are really differentiated and that they're competing on different services it's hard to reach that bar in New Zealand.
So let's move on and turn to the cost of living.
The 2020 election campaign.
Run through a quick fire round of questions to see how in touch both of these leaders are with some basic household items.
Oh, right. Okay.
Jacinda Ardern, how much is 2 litres of milk at the supermarket?
About $4.50.
Nah, $6.
At both New World and Countdown today, it was $3.40.
Oh, good deal.
$2?
2 litres?
Labor won, and within a few weeks, the Commerce Commission was tasked.
That market studies allow us to look at the structure of the market and the role that it may play in food prices in New Zealand. You'll often hear people making a comparison between, for instance, prices in New Zealand versus, say, Australia. Our view is that it is time that we inquired and used the Commerce Commission to look into whether or not our market is operating as it should, particularly given it's being identified as one of the more concentrated markets in the world.
In summary, they were asked to look at the state of competition in the market. So the rationale behind that is when competition is working effectively, we see businesses, competing, as the name would suggest, but we see competition on price, we see competition on service, we see good things like innovation in the market, and so on. And so when competition is muted or not working well, there is often an absence or a low level of those good positive factors.
The Commerce Commission, we've given them extra powers to really go in and properly investigate behaviours. We did it with fuel, now we're doing it with our supermarkets, and we will act on what they find. There are ways that we can ensure that consumers are in a competitive environment and that they're getting best bang for buck.
You'll guarantee that prices will come down?
I'll guarantee that we'll act on what the Commerce Commission presents, but let's let them go and do the job, use the powers they have to fully investigate what's going on.
The Commerce Commission's final 600-page report on the supermarket sector was released in March, and it came back with some pretty stark findings.
Firstly, the conclusion that competition is not working well for consumers.
The shelves may be full, but the Commerce Commission says supermarket choice is in short supply.
But I think we've had a fair go for a long time. What we need is some real competition, some honest-to-God competition like they've got overseas.
The background to that is, up until this point, advocates like Consumer NZ and others had been coming out going, something's funky in this market. We don't know quite what it is, but we think it's the structure of the market and the behaviour of the duopolists. But we need, the resource thrown at it to actually identify what the issues are. And the Commerce Commission's analysis pinpointed exactly where the issues are. So the headline was competition wasn't working well for consumers, and then they were able to drill down into the profitability of the supermarkets, and drew up the conclusion that has made headlines pretty regularly that the supermarkets are earning $1 million in excess profits every day.
And it's estimated the two main players are making about $430 million in excess profits a year. And you, our listeners, keep asking why the price of the grocery shop is sky high and seemingly going higher.
But then the market study went much further than that and looked at, what are the factors that are contributing to this? And it's a long list, but some of the headlines are the restrictive nature of things like land covenants. So that means where a New World goes into a shopping mall somewhere, the operator of that New World can negotiate with the landlords to make sure that no other supermarkets can enter into, a controlled geographic area around that. So the Commerce Commission identified that as a barrier to entry for new entrants coming into the market. And many of the other recommendations and conclusions from the report are directed at what are the things we need to do as a country to open this market up so that new entrants feel comfortable entering the market? Because at the moment, we've gone kind of 20 years without any real competitor entering the market to take on the duopolists.
Are the two big supermarket chains, are they actually breaking any rules here, or is this a case of this is a sector where it hasn't been regulated and they're just taking advantage of that?
It's hard to say at this stage. So the Commerce Commission made a number of references in its final report to matters that are being looked at further by the enforcement arms of the Commerce Commission. So that could mean Fair Trading Act breaches, which are the supermarkets are no stranger to prosecutions under the Fair Trading Act for misleading pricing and things like that, or